we have today a distinguished guest professor. He is Dr. Phil Kelly, the Roe R. Cross Distinguished Professor of Political Science from Emporia State University in the United States, from where the professor is joining us right now. As everybody knows, Professor Kelly is a world-leading authority in geopolitical studies, and today we have the privilege to hear directly from him a lecture resuming some of the points of his absolutely vital contribution to the discipline and to the science of geopolitics. So, without further ado, it is my sincere honor to give the floor to Professor Phil Kelly. Thank you so much, Professor Kelly, Phil, for, in my name and in the name of Corvinus University, for sparing the time to be here with us today. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. This is a distinct honor for me. I've looked forward to speaking to all of you, and I hope my opinions and my experience will be of worth to you. But let me express first that the experiences and opinions of myself are my own. You may share them or we can discuss them. I'm still growing, and my growth and change in my research really reflects classical geopolitics fertility. It is such a broad and enthusiastic area. I could spend the rest of my century in researching classical geopolitics. So it's an honor, and thank you so much, Nuno, for inviting me. My address will divide into three parts. I want to give a brief description of theory, and geopolitical, of course, would be the focus on that. And then secondly, my research career, which will be in a PowerPoint presentation, but it will focus on my leading up to the Stanford book and what the Stanford book did. And then I'm looking very much forward to questions that may follow. I have my own pad and I want to grow from them, and we can have a good discussion. So let me start with the background of theory and classical geopolitics just for a few minutes, okay? I'm a theorist. My focus, of course, is classical geopolitics, but I like all parts of international relations models. Now, I've mentioned two words here, theory and model. Let me go into those briefly. A theory, to me, is based upon probability. It's not 100%. If A happens, there is some possibility that B will happen because of A. Not totally, I don't give you a percentage, but there is a probability that if A happens, B is going to happen because of A. And this is why geopolitics is so interesting to me, is by far, geopolitics has the most theories. I've counted well over 60, where the other international relations approaches don't nearly come to that amount. A model is just simply a collection of theories that fit a particular definition of that model. That there are no geopolitical theories, there are theories that adhere to the geopolitical definition, and those go into the model. The model does nothing except just collect theories that fit the definition of that model. So that, again, my definition of geopolitics would be international placement affecting states' international behavior, but there are a lot of different definitions. I like the geopolitical model because it contains by far the most theories, as I've mentioned, but I'm also a realist. I think realist is by far the most important for decision-making within governments. In my government in the United States, certainly President Nixon, President Obama, I think even Biden would be a realist. And I think realism is probably the best approach in foreign policy. That's just my opinion. To define geopolitics, let me go in levels, in steps. On the most simple, geography impacts on states' foreign affairs. 6 words. Geography impacts on states' foreign affairs. But if you want to get a little further on, and I think this shows in the PowerPoint too, geopolitics is the study of the locations and positions of states, regions, and resources as affecting a state's international behavior. It's right there on that listing. And one could add a lot of other traits to that definition. You could look at climate change, global warming. You could look at distance, migration, demography, choke points, migration, shape of countries, frontiers, borders, sea and land power. The list goes on. So you could take the definition that's before you, and you could add a lot of criteria to that, a lot of concepts to that. Well, what does geopolitics give you then? What does it contribute? It contributes two things. It gives you a spatial platform for looking at foreign affairs of countries. It gives you a structure, it gives you a special map. And then secondly, it gives you a lot of theories that can complement that map. Let me give you an example. The Peloponnesian War of ancient Greece, Sparta against Athens. It took on a variety of theories with a structure that we would call a checkerboard structure. So taking that structure, that platform of that war, eventually won by Sparta, you could also add shatter belts, you could add sea and land power, choke points, buffers, distance, plague, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, those theories are neutral, they're timeless. I can compare ancient Greek with contemporary South America. They would be timeless, they would be ubiquitous, they can lend to scientific methodology and policy making, sometimes cyclical, logical, state-centered for the most part. So that's my introduction. That would be theory and model, but again, theory is just simply a sentence of probability. So we can go from there then, if you want. That would be my first part. I just wanted to sort of set the structure of what I'm going to be talking about. Well, let me see. Okay. The PowerPoint that I have, we'll go through that relatively quickly, but it would be a history of my research into classical geopolitics. Don't be too impressed, but it goes probably close to 50 years. I mentioned in my title, Twists and Turns. There have been opportunities in my path, a lot of surprises, a lot of mistakes. I think my advice to anyone that would be doing any kind of research, follow up these twists and turns. Do diverse opportunities. Take what comes before you. And then after the PowerPoint, we can open this up to questions and comments if you'd like. Well, let me get into the PowerPoint, and we're following, we'll try to do this. This would be my advice. Follow my passion, follow one's passion. I tell this to students, that the travel ahead of you is not always direct, it's not consistent. You have missteps, detours. I am just amazed at when I feel dry on my research, when my creativity laps, something is always there to prompt me. I don't know if that's your experience or will be that experience, but I've been into classical geopolitics for decades. I am still stimulated by new ideas. Again, I think that reflects the richness of classical geopolitics. So again, I would go with this definition. Geopolitics is the study of how position, location of countries impacts upon their international behavior. One of my consistent patterns, and I didn't realize until later on in my research, that a consistent theme of my research has been to clarify theories and then to apply them. Now, you could do this in all international relations models. I have done it in classical geopolitics. I have a list here. Turn the page on that. I worked earlier on shatter belts. I've dealt with the Mandela effect on checkerboards, critical geopolitics models, heartlands, the lintel state. I could list others, but I wanted to clarify those concepts because the old concepts were getting in my way. I couldn't go beyond them. For example, shatter belts, I had to redefine that definition because I couldn't apply it. And once I could redefine it, in some cases statistically, then I could apply it throughout the world. A shadow belt is a region in conflict of two levels of conflict, the strategic and the local. It isn't just a region in conflict, but it would be a region with those two levels. And if you had the two levels, then it made sense. I could put it in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I could put it before World War I, in front of World War II. You could look at Yemen today. You could look at Syria today, and certainly Ukraine. So all of those have been areas. I think I could give other examples. Well, let me go to my first research, and I didn't even know I was doing geopolitics. This was in my doctoral dissertation, had nothing to do with geopolitics. I barely knew the name back then. But I took a part of that dissertation, and this was a voting study on the United Nations among the Latin American countries. My career started with Latin America. And I put a statistical relation, a regression analysis on it. And in that, I found that distance from the United States to Latin American countries affected their voting in the United Nations on United Nations emergency forces in Africa and the Middle East. So again, this was my first article. I have used it ever since, once I recognized that it was geopolitical. But this was published way back in the middle 1970s. And again, through a regression statistical analysis, using a multiplicity of variables, I could find with a high level of statistical satisfaction that the countries furthest from the United States were more favorable to votes on United Nations intervention. The countries closest were more opposed. Had nothing to do with the United States, but yes, it did have to do with the United States because those countries closest had been invaded by Yankee imperialism. So I sort of started with that. And when I say twists and turns, I was in a lunch line in a conference in Arizona, and I asked a colleague, I wanted to get into geopolitics. This would be in the 1980s. I think that was the beginning of the resurrection of the first generation of the resurrection of classical geopolitics. I asked a colleague, who do I check in Latin America for geopolitics? They said Maramatus. And so I wrote to the general. He sent me some of his books. I did an article on his. That article was published in London in the Journal of Latin American Studies. I read everything as far as books, and I couldn't get his journal articles. I found those later. But it's sort of interesting that before I published that paper, I gave the paper at a conference in Canada, and he was in the audience. And I always thought that was fun. This general in Latin America evaluating my geopolitic analysis of him. He liked my article, and I found out later that he had it published throughout Latin America. Then another area that this was probably my first effort in clarifying a theory and then applying it. And I came across the word shatter belts. I think my middle name now is Shatter Belts. But the concept, the traditional concept simply said it was a region in conflict. I couldn't use that. That definition did not work. And so I wanted to refine that definition, and I refined it statistically. And I found that shatter belts come in two levels. That would be a local level, such as a civil war between warring factions within a country or within a region. And that still doesn't make a shatter belt until you have outside powers coming in on one side or the other. And this forms a shatter belt. A shatter belt is very dangerous because it leads to escalation of conflict. I found 4 shatter belts in the Peloponnesian War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a shatter belt. Today, Ukraine is a shatter belt. The Yemen would be a shatter belt. I was a Fulbright scholar in Paraguay, loved the country. And I did a lot of research, as I taught too in a couple of universities in Asunción, but I was given enough time through the embassy to do research on that. I had lunch with another Fulbright professor, Thomas Wigham of the University of Georgia. We agreed over lunch to write an article on the geopolitics of Paraguay. Now, That article isn't all that important, although I think Paraguay is important. But my example on that is take every opportunity. I grew from that article, and it was a good article to deal with. And I saw Paraguay. I've written about Paraguay and other areas too, but I could see Paraguay either as a heartland of South America. I think Paraguayans sort of look at themselves as that. It certainly is a buffer country losing territory. And I also plugged it into a lintel state where it was sort of a lintel between Brazil and Argentina. And also it shared with Brazil the hydroelectric power plant on the Paraná River at Itaipu. One other thing that I did during this period, I'm looking at the 1980s, 1990s, beyond the, I established a good deal of contact with Latin American geopolitical journals, both military and civilian. I have listed some of them there. Probably the major one would be GeoSur. Bernardo Quagliotti was a very strong supporter of mine, but I continued in Spanish to publish in those journals. That kept me alive with writing and thinking about theory and application of theory. So there was a good deal of enthusiasm that I put. And even today, I don't get a lot, several times a year, I get requests for help from cadets and military academies based upon some of these journals. My first book on geopolitics came as a discussion with a professor at American University, Jack Child. And we were at a boring business meeting, I think in Boston, and we were on the back row of the audience and we started talking. And before that business meeting was done, we had agreed to do a book, an edited book. I have there, it was published in the United States with Reiner Publishers, but it was also published in Spanish in Argentina. And it had 8 South American authors, Maramatus, Quagliotti, a variety of them, and then 6 North American authors and 1 Brit author. And we did that again in a conversation. My next book was with you. I think you like that title, Checkerboards and Shatterbelts, Geopolitics of South America. That I wanted to mention this book because I have published 5 books, all of them different. The procedures to them were different, how they were developed within that format. In this case, this is the University of Texas Press book, and they contacted me. I don't remember even doing a contract with them, a legal contract, and it was good to work with an editor. I want to emphasize that you want a friendly, helpful editor when you're doing a book, and I think also for an article. And that I had a woman editor. She was very interested. She had read some of my conference papers. I said, I have another chapter to write. And she said, no, don't do that chapter. You're fine as it is. I had something like 45 maps in that book. University of Kansas helped me with those maps, and I think the book was a success. But don't you love that title? As in the 1990s, over the course of the centuries, a new obstacle. And I call these things obstacles because, again, I need to clarify them because a lot of times they're not clarified. And this would be critical geopolitics. It would be a new variety or a variety very different from traditional classical geopolitics. In some ways, critical geopolitics was actually an attack on classical geopolitics. It actually said that it was an imperialistic, it was power politics, an imperialistic threat to international peace. And so what I did, I took a whole year on a sabbatical and read everything I could about postmodern geography, critical geopolitics, and I formulated a manuscript. The manuscript was probably close to 60 or 70 pages. I had 80 or 90 footnotes, and I applied it to this journal in London, the Political Geography at the time, and I think they thought that it was quite important because the 3 reviewers, you see their pictures there, were all leading scholars, and I know Klaus Dobbs better than the other ones, the one that's giving a talk. but they were all top people in that area. And they looked over my manuscript. I think they liked it, although they were very clear they didn't agree with what I was saying. But at least they were not typical prima donnas in academia. They were willing to publish my article, even though they disagreed with it. And they made some helpful suggestions. Klaus Dodds suggested, why don't we try to figure how we can combine classical and critical? And I gave it lip service, but I don't think it's possible. And I still don't think it's possible. There are parts of critical geopolitics that I like. I don't like the radical area of it. These are some of the differences in that. In the critical, I really think the critical is more revolutionary and it is violent. There is an emancipation exposed, but basically it is a deconstruction document. Excessive elite bias, and what you do is you uncover that bias, and once you uncover it, then you can work against it. It's typical revolutionary rhetoric. I like the normative, I like the decision making, I don't like the radical nature of it. I'm a moderate liberal, if anything. So this article has gotten a good deal of international acclaim. That I get requests by critical geopolitical writers, and I just simply can't do the critical. I'm not a postmodernist, I'm a modernist. So again, that was a problem that I had to get over with, just like I did with shatter belts. I defined as best I could. This was a long article, but it certainly shaped some of my thinking, and I think it was a contribution. Next, I moved to Greece. I moved to ancient Greece, and I did a very fun type of geopolitical assessment of ancient Greece. Again, Sparta versus Athens, and you can see that's a checkerboard, the blue versus the beige, and that would be a map of ancient Greece. You've got Persia at the top, you've got Syracuse at the bottom, you've got Sparta, Corinth, Boeotia, and then on the area of Athens, you've got the Argos, you've got Athens, Corcyra, and the Athenian allies. And in that, I was able to give that actually in ancient Olympia, Greece, quite a experience right off of the Olympic Stadium. And that was published in a variety of areas. It was even published in South America, but it was a chapter in an Agnew book on political geography. And I later did an article where I compared ancient Greece with contemporary South America. I could use the same concepts, I could use the same checkerboard structure, shatter belts, buffers, et cetera, and I could make sense out of it. The patterns were different. Ancient Greece was conflictual. South America was a country at peace, a zona de paz. Then, again, take advantage of what you have. And this next moved me over to Rome. And I was contacted by a person by the name of Tiberio Graziani. I still have good contacts with him. He was leading a Roman geopolitical institute. I've had lunch with him a couple times. He publishes anything I give him. And he's actually led me to other publications. He's been a tremendous support for my research. I think his institute, look up on your iPhone or your computer, Tiberio Graziani, and I think you'd be, I'm not completely certain of his institute, but I think it's fairly large and fairly influential. But he's been a tremendous help to me. I have at the bottom Murad Jalilov, was an Emporia State student, and I have published with my students. I think I have 12 or 13 students that have published with me. And Murad Jalilov was an Azerbaijan student, and we did something on Ukraine. He's now a PhD candidate at the University of Illinois. But again, follow all of your twists and turns within your research career. Next, this is the same situation. I was surfing on my computer, like I'm sure you guys do, and I came across the word Mackinder Forum. And in the Mackinder Forum, it had a very bad first page. but there was a membership subscription to it, so I filled the thing out and sent it in. Didn't get a response for a whole year, but then I was invited to a conference in Virginia sponsored by the forum. Now that group, which I've been active in ever since, I think this was probably 2013, 2014, something like that. That forum group has been extremely valuable to my research, and it really helped publish my Stanford book. Leonard Hultberg is the United States leader. There's a leader. I'll show you a picture of him from the British side. But they really were instrumental in helping me get my Stanford book, my Stanford University Classical Geopolitics, a new analytical model published. And turn the page on that. At the bottom of that, I don't know the whole story here, but Len Hultberg and some others recommended me to Stanford University, to the editor there. And they suggested that I was certainly, I'd be important to writing a book with them. And so again, those kinds of groups, Graziani in Rome and Lindbergh and Hultberg in the United States, they're very important to having a group support of your research. Now, with that, in that Stanford book, again, every publisher, I think a book or article is different. You want to link in on that editor. It took 2 years to get that book published through all of the bureaucracy that you go through. My submission to that was 6 pages. And it must have been convincing because the supportive editor relayed to me that the manuscript had been submitted to 3 reviewers. That's always good news. Usually it's 2 or 3 reviewers. And the editor, Jeffrey Byrne, kept me appraised. I think he really wanted the book published. I sent the whole manuscript in. I think that's another plus if you can do that in publishing. Give them the whole manuscript. Don't say I'm going to write the manuscript in 2 years. Try to have the manuscript written and in the best shape you can get it. That he put it out to 3, first it was 2 reviewers. The reviewers, the first reviewer accepted the manuscript almost immediately. But he didn't really give much about it. He didn't give reasons why he was accepting it. I will never know who the first reviewer was. I have my suspicions. So what Jeffrey Byrne did, my Stanford editor, he added a 3rd reviewer, McKibben Owens. Now, Jeffrey Byrne was more interested in the 2nd reviewer, which was Jeff Sloan. I have a picture of him coming up. And it's interesting that they were keying off on that 2nd reviewer. I don't think they took the 1st reviewer or the 3rd reviewer seriously, although all 3 reviewers accepted the book. Now that top person, pretty handsome guy, Jeff Sloan, is now I think at the Naval War College for a year. I've met him at a variety of times at conferences. He took a year to go over the book. And Jeffrey Byrne kept saying, do you want to keep doing this? Do you want to keep doing it? And I said, yes, let's take our time. He gave me about 15 pages of suggestions on the book. Now that's a little unusual, but he took a lot of time on helping me on that book. You've got to have favorable reviewers. You've got to have mentors. And I followed everything that he said on those 15 pages. Now, McKibben Owens, I've never met. He is the editor of the journal Orbis, and he's done quite a bit on civil-military relations. He's written some good stuff on defending classical geopolitics. But again, they were keying in on Jeffrey Sloan, and I would suggest that too. He by far did the most for me. Well, what happened then, they approved the manuscript. And I followed, you follow through that. You follow all of the suggestions of the reviewers, as some of you know. I had to defend the changes that they suggested, so that took some time. There were 2 committees in Stanford that went over that manuscript. They both did approve, and again, my editor probably helped put those through. My prose, the punctuation, They left the final index up to me. I did that. I don't mind doing indexes. I think they're sort of fun. You can sort of work out in that in your computer. I had to go along with promotional materials. I had to get permissions. Now there were a couple permissions that I needed. In other words, I quoted from other publications more extensively, so I felt legally it was better that I contact the owners of those publications. They were very good. I don't think Stanford had to pay for anything on that. But again, it took 2 years from the original submission for the final product. The book was published and got to me in February 2016. Now, I'm not criticizing the 2 years. It was just that the University of Texas was much more quickly done. The Stanford book was much more thoroughly done, and I respected Stanford for doing that. So the 2 years were certainly something that I had no problem with. But again, my recommendations on something like that is have the manuscript written in the best form that you possibly can. Try to luck out on getting an editor that will help you on getting through that. Follow all of the procedures, do everything they tell you to do. Do it as meticulously and carefully as you possibly can. Be patient. And then the interesting thing is see how the book has been received by the academia and by the readers of Geopolitics. I think that book, again, Classical Geopolitics, a New Analytical Model, I think it's been positively received in the field. If you look at that book, the chapters in it, some of the chapters are much longer than others. The introduction, of course, was not long but important. Several geopolitical approaches, I went through that. The assumptions are something that you just have to agree to. You can't prove or disprove, you agree to it. An assumption for me with geopolitics, classical geopolitics, is you just simply have to assume that environment affects behavior. And there's no way of proving that, you just accept it. That would be an assumption. But the geopolitical theories, chapter 5, as you can see, was close to 50 pages, and the applications of the model were nearly that long too. And then you had an appendix and then setting the course. So that was how the book was organized. What does the book say? Well, again, I had 3 ambitions for that book. I wanted to improve the acceptance of classical geopolitics as a mainline recognized and legitimate international relations model. I wanted to raise the level of it. I wanted to separate geopolitics from realism. And I wanted to clarify the terms theory and model. And again, I've given you a theory as a probability, model as a collection of theories. And I think that has had an impression on the field. I have never had criticism for, I have with realism. I still have some colleagues that say that geopolitics is a part of realism. I really don't think it is. But in the case of theory and model, I think those are accepted. And that was a contribution that I have. And again, that would be one of the missions of the book, Geopolitical Model. I have definition, I think, is so important. And then again, the theories. There are no geopolitical theories. There are theories that fit the geopolitical definition. And I think that has been important for the field. And then again, assumptions. I had a whole chapter, I think I had 10 or 12 assumptions. But again, assumptions are just something that you have to believe. And you can't prove them, you can't disprove them. They're the bedrock of your research. You just simply have to, it's just a leap of faith on those. And again, geopolitics fits all sizes of countries, not just the larger countries. Central pivot renders advantages and disadvantages. Placement affects action or inaction. You know, you can just go on on that. I had a long session on classical versus the postmodern, in other words, the critical geopolitics. I tried to duplicate, in some cases, the approaches that I had in that earlier article. I started gathering theories, and I located 60. I think I have more than 60 now. Some of those 60s are combinations of theories, but I felt that by getting 60 theories, and you can sort of see in the small print, I tried to put them in groupings, but the 60 theories I thought were also proof that geopolitics, classical geopolitics, had some authority, had some standing in that. And again, by far, geopolitics, classical geopolitics, has more theories. If you take realism, which I really like, I like realism a great deal, I don't think you can get much beyond 8 or 10 theories that you would classify within a realist definition. And so this is, again, you can look at all of those theories and you can see I can take any of those and just do a lot of research on them and then apply them to history, apply them to contemporary politics. That field is so tremendously fertile for research. It's almost a disease that I have. I can't stay away from classical geopolitics. I'm doing a manuscript right now. I'm just entering into it. I've agreed to do a cluster of theories. I'm starting to write on that. And I'm taking the United States as the basic variable. The United States is isolated in the Western Hemisphere. It has no threats, of course, within the Western Hemisphere. It is a very wealthy area. I look upon North America as probably the wealthiest, most powerful area of the world. I have now classified it as a global heartland. But its major threat, and the threat would be very dangerous, would be coming from Eurasia, which is the dominant continent of the world. So coming from Eurasia, if you've got a unity in Eurasia among the major countries, and they are hostile to the United States, and they have a strong naval power, okay, those three characteristics, the United States is in trouble. And we have a Monroe Doctrine. We have a dominant global navy. We have a forward presence of our military on the rimlands of Eurasia. I can go on and on and on within that problem area. I can list 15 theories. I think I could do more than 15 in a cluster. I mean, you can look at shatterbelts, you can look at heartlands, you can look at checkerboards, you can look at sea power, you can look at natural resource, you can look at isolation. You can just go on and on and on. You can take these theories and put them in clusters and apply them to an historic event or a contemporary issue. It is just so rich. It is so tremendously rich. And I envy any of you that are getting yourself into these areas. So again, I overcame, I thought, certain methodological obstacles in that book. I separated political geography from geopolitics. I've tried to define scientific as statistical or quantitative. I have done some statistical work in my geopolitical research. I'm combining concept and theory. I just don't define concept. I just put it to theory. I've accepted both the organic and the geostrategic heritages of classical geopolitics. Perhaps with the organic, you might be able to put a scientific to it. I have tried to remove power politics and Wall Street catastrophes from classical definition. And basically what I've done is apply clarified theories to events. Okay, so I've had these approaches, statistical and hypothesis testing. For example, this would be statistical. The more borders a country possesses, the more war involvements that country suffers. I have a statistical relationship with that. It's not a particularly strong statistical relationship, it's a Spearman rule, but at least it gives you some indications of that. And then also, how do you apply a theory rationally? And you never know. In the Vietnam conflict, which the United States got itself into, I think it was a vast mistake. I think we had the wrong theory. The theory of Kennedy, Johnson, Eisenhower, Truman was the domino theory. Communism, one country falls to communism in another country, and down you go with dominoes. I think if they would have had a checkerboard structure, a geopolitical checkerboard structure, I think we wouldn't have gotten into that conflict. So again, these are the two problems that I have in classical geopolitics. Classical geopolitics is not perfect. It has some problems to it, the theory to it. I simply, in some cases, don't have an answer to those problems. For example, on theory, how do you show probability? You don't. I don't know how to do that. I can do it statistically with hypothesis testing, but that probably is 5% of the research I do. How do you take a heartland and really prove it? Well, you just do it. You just say it's a theory, and I can't go any further than that. And then secondly, how do you really apply something that you are aware of? You can do the best job you can. For example, I really thought I could take the ancient Peloponnesian War on a checkerboard platform and compare it to a South American geopolitical checkerboard platform in South America. And I think I could do that. But I'm not totally certain where certain theories really do enhance an understanding of an international event. In other words, theory and application. I'm still struggling with those. I have the Battle of Saboya. That would be an example of a shatter belt. But again, let's go further than that. Probably the only application I can do is do the best I can, and on that. On that book, I had 8 historic contemporary applications: Peloponnesian War, Ukraine shatter belts, United States. I think we had 2 shatter belts in the Ohio Valley. Shatter belts now emerging. 3 Americas in geopolitical terms: geopolitics of the United States and Paraguay, geopolitics of ancient Rome. Some of those may not have made it into the books. And then in summary, if I could just sort of follow this out, I don't want to take any more time on this, that I would consider, after doing that book, it came out in 2016, that for some reason I think I'm doing better research now than I ever did before or during that. I have gone much beyond that book. For example, the North American Heartland. I think this is one of my major pieces. It never got into the book. I did this research after the book was published. I have done the geopolitics of water, Mississippi River barge canals. I have done rescuing classical geopolitics. I've done American sea power. I've worked into the geopolitics of scarcity, where I have taken climate change and put it into the stability of global politics. I have been on a tear, and certainly Professor Morgado has helped me on that. He has influenced me on the decision-making area. We are exchanging ideas. That has been very, very important to me. So just again, I'm still growing. I'm still a child. I applaud being before you, because again, these are my experiences. These are my opinions. They may not fit with yours, and that's fine. But again, if I could just say, follow the twists and turns of my subtitle. This classical geopolitics disease is a very seductive one, and I intend to keep working just as your professor does. And your professor has done very, very strong research in classical geopolitics. So that would be my PowerPoint. And if any of you have questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them as best I can.
Thank you very much, Professor Kelly. Thank you very much, Phil, for this brilliant lecture. I barely have words to describe how grateful and how happy I am. Thank you for sharing all the knowledge that you did, especially concerning theory and methodology that, as you know, I am so much interested in. I especially enjoyed also your views on critical geopolitics. I basically agree with everything that you said. So critical geopolitics.
No, if I could say this, I really think our research is paralleling. I think it's coming together. I think you've really enhanced some of my thinking, but we don't have to be agreeing. We don't have to agree. I think out of disagreement, we come understandings too, but I agree with you. I don't see any areas where we really disagree.
Exactly, that's what I was saying. So it's okay to disagree, but I cannot disagree from you when I'm agreeing from you. So I really need to speak out when you make the statements that you make about critical geopolitics, because specifically concerning this stream in the discipline, it's a bit worrying. I would say that it's pretty hegemonic. The criticism that critical geopolitics receive, it's very limited, to not say that it's non-existent, and that's not scientific positioning whatsoever. So the position of science is a permanent adaptation of new ideas, of new criticism, of new approaches, and that's not what we have been seeing in the discipline since the 19th, since this critical geopolitics start appearing and producing and formulating. During the book launch a couple of weeks ago, I called you the lonely soldier of classical geopolitics for many years, to not say even decades. And that's quite true. You and a few other scholars like Geoff Sloan that you mentioned, or Maccabee Owens, you have been a rarity in the discipline because, as we have already mentioned, the majority of scholars and the majority of the production of literature that is made in geopolitics today is in fact under critical geopolitics, and the sense of criticism and of updating of this kind of approach it has been rare, as I said. Plus, I would also like to thank you for inspiring us to produce more. For example, myself, I am trying to finish my book on neoclassical geopolitics already since 2018, and I keep working more and more, and the book has no end. I cannot see the light at the end of the tunnel, so I will try to put extra effort this year to try to finish the book and to look for a publisher. So thank you for this inspiration too. And one last comment that I would also like to do, more policy oriented, is that once again, I also agree with you that the unification of the Eurasian massland would be or would represent the biggest threat for the United States security. And as we also talked during our book launch a couple of weeks ago, that I invite people to check out on the YouTube, is that the project of the Belt and Road Initiative contributes then for that unification of the Eurasian massland, first via economic relations, international trade and transportation, and probably later on in terms of political influence, and most likely in terms of military consequences too.
Let me give you a couple examples. I won't take a lot of time on these. I know you have questions maybe. I just recently, well, I should say after this pandemic, we can't do anything, but a couple of years ago, I was at a conference. A pretty well-known guy was giving a talk on Speakman, Nicholas Speakman, who I really admire. But to me, Speakman was a realist and a geopolitical writer. He was both. He wasn't purely a geopolitical. That's okay. You know, I have no problem with that. But the speaker, I raised the question with the speaker. I don't think he liked what I was saying. But I told the speaker that if he could differentiate between realism and geopolitics, it would make his talk a lot clearer. And I don't think he liked that. And then one other example, that in my South American studies, I did a study on a Colombian general, Londoño. And he wrote 8 or 10 books, very prolific, and had a lot of theories. I've used the theories, but he had one theory that was the 3 borders theory. And what he was saying is where 3 frontiers, national frontiers, come together, you have more conflict. I was skeptical. I didn't see that. A lot of your frontiers come together in the middle of a jungle. Nobody knows where they are. So I applied a statistical analysis on that. I knew conflict and I knew borders. and I couldn't find a statistical relationship. So to me, that was not a legitimate theory. Theory has to show some evidence of probability. Fortunately, or unfortunately, you can't find that statistically. You can a little bit. But again, that would be one of the problems in my research. How do you really nail in a theory? And in my case, I hate to say it, but a theory is a theory. And I leave it at that. If it's common sense, if it seems to have some rational, logical basis, I'll accept it. And that would be in my system of 60 theories. So that's where I am.
Very well said. I would relate your definition of theory with the context, the concept and the context of possibilism in the geopolitical approach. So this inheritance that we receive not only from the French School of Geopolitics, but perhaps mainly from them, of possibilism. So geography offers you opportunities that you might take advantage or not.
Yes.
And this would lead to the first question. So I will take the floor and I will be the first one to pose you a question.
Okay.
So it's a question on decision makers. So in your view, and in line with all the research that you did and the precious contribution that you presented and you gave to geopolitics, would you consider that the study of the decision makers, and I mean by this specifically the study of their perceptions, and even more specific, the perceptions on space, would have a role on geopolitics as science, or we should abandon more or less or leave that stream of studies aside and focus more on the international system and on systemic constraints, because those types of studies are more likely to give us a better explanation of the state's behavior.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And this is an area where recently I've grown, thanks to you. But my earlier research was based upon geopolitics strictly being state-centered. A state is the actor. Okay, the state will act basically as it perceives its environment. It doesn't matter if you're liberal, conservative, communist, fascist, capitalist, whatever. But I have changed in that I do think that there are certain perceptions based upon geography. And let me say that again, that the United States is isolated. The threat is coming from Eurasia. That would be a geographical reality. That from that geographical reality comes a geopolitical tradition. So the isolation of the Western Hemisphere, the threat from Eurasia, that would be geography, isolation, distance, and so on and so forth. But from that fear comes a tradition, and we would call that, among other traditions, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine does not want Eurasian bases, especially in Middle America. Now, from the Monroe Doctrine will come immediate decision-making policies and actions. So a good example of that would be President Kennedy, that he learned that the Soviet Union was putting missile bases in Cuba. Now, I don't know if he even know the word Monroe Doctrine, but he was acting in line with the Monroe Doctrine, and that you do not want Eurasian bases in America that would threaten our security. So President Kennedy was operating within a geopolitical tradition where he had a policy that reflected that tradition. And if I could go further on that I don't see any of our presidents in the United States as necessarily geopolitical. I do see presidents as realist. Nixon and Kissinger were realist presidents. They follow realist theory all the way down. I think you could see the first Bush, you could see Obama, and I think you could see Biden as realists. I think if I could compare that to geopolitical, I think all of the presidents that we've had act within this geopolitical traditions in their actions and in their policies, but often these are not immediate, they're sporadic. That I would not call President Biden a geopolitical thinker, I would call him a realist. but occasionally he does reflect geopolitical traditions. What do you think of that?
Well, you are the expert about American politics. I would not dare to give any comment on that.
But no, that's some of my recent thinking, quite frankly.
But yes, absolutely. I will pass here for other questions and try to find what the audience would like to hear from you. So Virak is commenting there are 2 questions, but I cannot see them. So just a bit more of patience. Okay, so now I can see. Okay, so Attila Farkas asks you, dear professor, how do you see the predictive forecasting power of the neoclassical geopolitical approach?
Say that over again.
Dear professor, how do you see the predictive forecasting power of the neoclassical classical geopolitical approach? So Attila is asking about both. So the classical approach and the neoclassical approach that I have also been trying to elaborate. So basically to call the decision makers into the explanatory model. Please.
That's a good question. I really haven't thought a lot about predictive in geopolitics. I don't know about the neo. I'll just combine the 2 of them. But certainly you do have predictive within geopolitics. I think that in the case of the United States, we certainly have geopolitical traditions that we would act upon. The Monroe Doctrine, sea power, the value of New Orleans and the Mississippi watershed, the sphere of influence. We don't want the Caribbean to be a shatter belt. We want the Caribbean to be a sphere of influence. We want friendly countries on the rimlands. We want to have bases, both Navy and Army, on the 3 perimeral, the 3 rimland areas, Western Europe, the Persian Gulf, and East Asia. Those are traditions that I think you could use those traditions as predictors for the policies that we are enacting. For example, I think if I could even use the word President Trump, I wasn't a real strong advocate of him, but I think with Obama and Trump, and I'm certainly with Biden, that there is a turn to Asia. And that I do think that the United States traditions are seeing more threats, more challenges coming from Asia, East Asia, than they would be coming from the Middle East, certainly from Latin America or Africa, and for Europe. So that would be an example where President Biden, as well as other presidents from the United States, are perceiving and they're predicting challenges to the United States coming from East Asia that we are putting more and more of our military force. For example, we have 6 battle fleets surrounding Eurasia, 2 in the Mediterranean, 2 in the Atlantic, and 2 in the Pacific. The further Pacific one that would be closer to the United States, I can't give you the numbers of those fleets, but we have one fleet that is basically in Japan, the Philippines, and so on and so forth, right in the South China Sea, extending well over into the Straits of Malacca. But it's interesting that the supportive fleet that is coming out of the west coast of the United States is moving further and further westward into Asia, and the Asian fleet of the United States is moving further in toward the Indian Ocean. So there is some evolution of those military posturings that are showing a much more, a stronger interest of the United States in Eurasian geopolitics. Now that to me would be a prediction that you have traditions, there's more of an awareness, there's more of a threat, more of an opportunity. I'm not looking at necessarily a war between China and the United States. I just don't see that. But at least there is more of a challenge there. And the 2 battle fleets of the United States Navy are moving more into that area than they were before. And I think that's one indication. Now, the United States really doesn't want to be bogged down with Middle East. That's one reason why we're getting out of Afghanistan. We've gotten out of Iraq, for better or for worse. But I think we want to give up the Middle East and put some, repair our burdens in NATO and in your area. I think that Putin is still a major threat because of his weakness and because of his recklessness. But I think the major geopolitical interest of the United States, military and foreign policy, has really turned to East Asia. Now that, I don't know if that helps on the predictions, but in your case, I think that would be a prediction that for some decades now, our presidents, Republican and Democrat, have really wanted to turn more to Asia and to relieve ourselves from the Middle East, especially. We're giving almost no attention to South America, Brazil included. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does, Phil. Thank you very much. We have here another question from Andras Balo. He is writing a thesis on Latin American agricultural policies. And his question is, how did you delimit geographically the region of Latin America in your books? Did you define any subregions too? I know there are many theories and methodologies on this. Thank you very much.
There's a lot of ways. That's a good question. There's a lot of ways of dividing, and Nuno, you can help me on this. There's a lot of ways of dividing Latin America. I think it's very, very important. I did a podcast a couple months ago and emphasized the three geopolitical versions of America. North America, which would be the United States. I have no idea where Mexico could go both ways. But North America, the geopolitics is east and west. Again, it's Eurasian balancing, prevent that hostility from Eurasia. North America is relatively united, it's relatively powerful. So North American geopolitics would be strategic Eurasian. If you look at Middle America, the second America, now, Middle America would be the Caribbean and Central America. Again, Mexico straddles both. I'm not against Mexico, it just straddles both. But Middle America is, right now, is a sphere of influence, a very neglected one, a sphere of influence of the United States. It is still strategic through the Monroe Doctrine, but in a negative way. The United States wants to keep Middle America from becoming a shatter belt. We want to keep Middle America as a sphere of influence, even though we're ignoring it and abusing it. We don't want a Eurasian threat in Middle America. South America is a totally different geopolitical experience. It is not Eurasian. It is not strategic. It is internal to the continent. You rarely hear the word Mackinder, Speakman, Northern Eurasia. You hear border conflict, isolating Brazil from aggressive as neighbors. You see development, you see common markets. You see the checkerboard. There is a checkerboard there of the Brazil, Chile, Colombia versus Venezuela, Peru, Argentina. I think that's very clear. You see four border countries. The border countries having, to me, suffered the wars of South America. They've suffered territorial dismemberment, but they've also kept the continent at peace and stability. Now, if you turn specifically, Nuno, I think you had this in your book. You turn to Goldberry, and there are other maps of South America, but he had a variety. He had a heartland, what was that, a staging area in the central part of Brazil. The Paraguayans looked at Itaipu, or they looked at Paraguay itself as a heartland. I teach my students the Charcas heartland, which would be Bolivia. In fact, there is in the Charcas heartland, there is a Mackinderist type of theory. Whoever controls Santa Cruz controls the triangle of Charcas. whoever controls the Triangle of Charcas controls South America, which is probably not very realistic, but certainly in the 1960s, the two passes into the Marañón River and through the Charcas were at least visualized by the Brazilian military. And so there was some identification of the Charcas heartland. So you can divide, and I'm sure you could divide others. There are all kinds of maps dividing South America, but I think that's a very good question. Geopolitics is map oriented. That would be your platform. That would be your spatial description. And maps are very important. I have tried to draw artificial maps and then have my students decide what kind of policies you see from those maps. So maps are very important, and I think South America and Latin America are very interested in drawing departments or map divisions. So that's a very good question, very interesting question. Read Nuno Morgado's chapter in his last book. He has all kinds of maps that I'm very familiar with.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you very much for your answer. This time I will step in because you know that South America is a topic of my heart.
Yes.
In the literature, we find all kinds of categories and classifications, some of them wrong. For example, making South America and Latin America synonymous. So that geographically that is incorrect. We could consider correct South America, Central America, and the Caribbean as Latin America. So that could be some more correct definition. So, I remember.
Yeah, and very confusing too, because the Caribbean is not necessarily Spanish. It's English, French, Dutch.
Precisely. So it's hard to trace the lines. But I remember when I was attending a class on geopolitics of Latin America many years ago, I remember a colleague, a student from Canada, and one time she was participating in the discussion and she said, but Canada should also be included in Latin America. And I immediately understood the reasoning behind it. And I asked her, it's because of Quebec, right? So you speak French. French, it's a language that comes from Latin. So therefore, you want to include Canada also in Latin America because of the language. So it's a linguistic classification. And she laughed and she said, that's exactly. So we want to put Canada together with Brazil, with Chile, with Argentina, because we don't want to be a part of the Anglo-Saxon world. I found it very, very interesting. I never thought about that before she came up with that kind of approach.
Well, could you call the United States a Latin American country too, that our largest demographic group is now Spanish surnamed?
That's absolutely correct. Yes.
Well, and we have a major, our signs are Spanish and English. We could become, this could be in the distant future, but we could become a bilingual country such as Canada. I would applaud that.
So that means that probably the concept of Latin America will expand until the North Pole.
Yes.
So we will see that the expression Latin America will overlap the American continent and they will become synonymous.
Yes.
So let me see, because I think that we have more questions here. Yes. So Attila Korompai asks, comments, geopolitics in practice is highly connected to geographic background, as you have indicated. Is it possible, in your opinion, to operate efficient geopolitics based on some global interest, thinking about climate problem?
Yes. I did some research, one of my recent articles that Tiberio published, that the geopolitics of scarcity. Okay, now the geopolitics of scarcity follows a theory. And the theory is, and I think this is a political science definitional theory, is that the more scarcity we have, now that would be anything, that could be marital partners, it could be jobs, it could be wealth, it could be power, but we will definitely have more and more scarcity in the world ahead. More people, fewer resources, a real challenge. The more scarcity we have, the more political conflict we have. There's not much we can do about that. I don't think we can all of a sudden change scarcity. We can do a little bit here, we can do a little bit there. We have far too many people on this earth, and the resources are diminishing, including climate change. We're going to have areas of the world that are so hot in the middle latitudes, they will be so hot that we will have mass migrations from them. I think it's obvious. It's obvious that, to me, if I could give you my geopolitical Yankee North American bias, that if you look at the globe and you look at North and South, the south part of the globe, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, I don't mean to say anything negative about South America, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, but a good deal of the southern area of the globe is water. That the northern area of the globe is more land and valuable land. The climate, the river systems, the fertility of the soil. The north is going to be the future of our globe, considering climate change. Okay, so my looking at this is that we are going to have more and more migration of human beings from areas that are simply too hot, too dry, no water, no food, no ability to live in the heat. We're going to have more and more migration to the north. Now, of course, in your countries, you're seeing immigration coming in from Africa, from the Middle East. This is a big issue with you guys in Hungary, but it certainly is with us too, with our Mexican border. Now, what's going to happen to that migration? Okay, I'm very skeptical. I fear the future, because are the northern peoples, now that could include Hungarians, that could include Kansans, are they going to accept the migration coming into their areas? Are we going to have acceptance of migrants coming in from designated areas, or are the northern peoples going to build walls? Are we going to have a gated future, militarily enforced, at the expense of the starving peoples from the south and the wealthier people to the north? How does that portend to our future based upon climatic change and the advancement of scarcity and conflictual politics? And you can see that in geopolitical terms. That's a geopolitical concept. And I don't know. I fear that the northern peoples will not receive the middle people in their migrations. It certainly is an issue in North American politics.
Thank you very much, Phil. Very pertinent questions. Concerning scarcity of resources, I would just like to add a kind of theoretical methodological note that I was thinking of from our colleague Émeric Choprat. He is one of the participants of the book that we wrote earlier this year, and he claims that it exists three kind of causal aspects for potential of conflict. He names the first one as the scarcity of resources, so the struggle for resources, exactly as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. Also geostrategic regions, so regions with particular interests. They can be choke points, they can be regions around borders, whatever they may be. Geostrategic regions in general, so this would be second causal chain for potential for conflict. And the third one that he mentioned is identity issues, so identity conflicts. Mm-hmm. Could easily inflammate and end up in a war or a conflict that could not be necessarily a war, but definitely a conflict.
And those three could easily fit into what I just said on scarcity, that you have choke points of migrations coming north. You certainly are going to have scarcity of water, scarcity of air, scarcity of fertility, soil and food. And you're going to have conflict to try to stop that. And I hope that our civilization will be able to support migrants integrate them into their societies, even though they may have different religions, different cultures, different economic resources, and that we can have a golden age in the future of human acceptance, human diversity of that acceptance, and we can have a good future. I don't know.
Coming back to the resources, I was also thinking of, I would like to raise here a topic which is the rare earths, so the rare metals. And I think that this is going to be a very hot topic for the 21st century, because China has a massive production of these elements, so these rare earths, these rare metals, and they are becoming absolutely vital for the production of new technological gadgets. So iPhones, computers, laptops, they are requiring or creating a heavier demand of these rare earths and rare metals. Would you have a word to say about this?
Well, right now in China, why China is so dominant in them is because China sells them cheaply. We have a good capitalistic trade world. The United States has ample minerals along those lines. We just haven't exploited them because it's more expensive. But I think as China becomes more developed, the cost of those is going to increase, and that we will have those resources produced worldwide. So I don't see a problem too much with that, but I'm not a total expert in that area. But again, and I think I expressed this in your book launching too, and I could be very wrong, but I don't see China and the United States entering into a serious military conflict. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, although maybe I'm looking at it wrongly. But I see China in a geopolitical state has some real problems. It's surrounded by hostile countries, including Russia. It has a population which is probably out of control. That population is becoming developed. Much of it is becoming urbanized. I think that the Chinese have a very antiquated government system, very corrupt, very inefficient, and that they're struggling to keep a stability with that middle class, that rising middle class. And they're wanting to do, they're wanting to stabilize that. I think they fear that. And I think any kind of challenges, I think your paper by the Japanese professor sort of showed this, that the foreign policy of China is more identity foreign policy, more of a nationalistic foreign policy. I don't see it as being a very threatening one. And that if you look at, I think I mentioned the hockey stick theory, that if you take two hockey sticks and put them together, but point the two out, that one would be the declining United States, the other would be the advancing China. But I don't think China is ever going to advance farther than the United States. But then following out the hockey stick that they're going to probably understand and work within that challenge. And I would use another possible geopolitical term called condominiums, where possibly the Chinese and the United States and possibly India will someday come together. And again, that could well fit climate change, that they want to have stability, protect their own wealth against immigration from the poor areas. So I could be wrong. I don't agree to the Thucydides trap of an inevitable war between the United States and China.
Thank you for that.
I have a lot of colleagues that would disagree with that, but I just can't see it.
Thank you very much for your views and your insight. I will ask the audience for more questions because the chat is now empty. So go ahead if you have questions for Professor Phil Kelly. This is the moment.
Are these coming from your students?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Good. I would value those.
But they are also a bit shy, so that's why I am giving them some gas to write here in the chat, and then I would be glad to read the questions to you.
I think they all deserve the highest of grades, Professor.
You are very kind. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I would invite Professor Kelly to give a final address or final comments if he would wish so.
Well, I have another brief example that I could give on the fertility of geopolitical concepts. I made up one myself, but I was supposed to give a talk in Kentucky, and the talk never materialized because of a tornado. And the tornado had come into the campus and had destroyed some of the buildings. So I was to give an address, and that address never happened. But I snuck in the back door of the library, having nothing to do that morning. And I came up with a geopolitical theory. I came up with a theory that fit the geopolitical model, and this was dealing with Paraguay. Paraguay as a lintel state. Now, a buffer state, but a buffer state with a lintel design. In other words, a lintel fits over your door, it fits over your window in architecture. It sort of stabilizes the foundation of those walls. Well, this is what Paraguay does with Brazil and Argentina, despite the Itaipu Dam, that Paraguay actually stabilizes southern cone of South America, Brazil, Argentina, because of its geographical place. And I think it has played off Argentina against Brazil. Now, how well it's done that, I don't know. But at least that shows some area of creativity within this area of classical geopolitics. It is such a tremendously rich area for research and publication that I encourage any of you to adopt it as your own. It can be fatal as far as a disease, but give it a try. And thank you, Nuno Morgado, for this invitation. I hope that I have confused your audience not too much, and that I've been able to share my opinions, and maybe they've influenced other people's opinions too. So thank you for this invitation.
Thank you very much, Professor Phil Kelly. Thank you so much for sparing the time to be here with us, giving us this brilliant lecture, your interesting insights. I had no idea about that story of yours with the tornado. It is very intriguing to see geography happening in front of your eyes, and therefore needing to deal with the impositions that it's created. Once again, thank you so much for coming here and giving us this brilliant lecture for
well, my thanks to you and to your institution and to your students.
Thank you very much. You are very kind.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So with this, we conclude our public lecture with Professor Phil Kelly. I thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to meet you in the next occasion. Thank you very much.
I too. Thank you.